Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 6. I hope that you are all doing well. Congrats now on being on the other side of test 1. So you get a sense of how those work. Test 2 and test 3 will basically be the same. In test 3, there is another added section that really is just based on things that you should have learned and grasped over the course of the class related to what we call our student learning outcomes, so the objectives of the class. So there will be an added point on that. Nothing that you can necessarily study for, in that you just need to be paying attention to everything that's going along. As I've been reaching out, I've pointed out a number of times, those listening guides are very helpful, particularly when they explain a bit about the song. So make sure that you're using the book, make sure that you're spending the time online, and make sure that you're going through everything. This is studying just to help you appreciate things. I don't know how your other classes are, but it was not uncommon when I was in college to have 4, 5, 6 books to go through in one class in one semester. And so with this one, you just have one. It's pretty light, easy reading, and you got the listening guides and all of that stuff. But it is important that you're doing that, and you're seeing that in my comments. I sure hope you're reading my comments. I'm getting the sense that not all of you are. But I am also seeing a little uptick in people that are replying back to me. So that's that. I think that, the only other thing that to keep on your radar is that concert report. You're going to watch a concert online, YouTube, Vimeo, whatever. It's not a concert that you're going to. Please make sure that you're familiar with what's being asked of you so that you're not getting into trouble at the very end. I am still seeing some people that are turning in assignments at the absolute last minute and either not hitting the full minimum word length of 250 words. And again, remember, those aren't my words. That point doesn't count. It's just your answer. Don't ramble on them. Don't just focus on the word count. Do the work. Try to get it done early. I tell you, and I've said it before, time management is just so crucial to a successful life. It just is. And so I should say good time management. So, this is a great time to start adapting that. Okay, so this week is an interesting week in that you're only going to really be primarily focusing on 2 bands. And we're also going to be moving off of North America, off of the United States, really for the first time in a meaningful way in this class, because we're going to go over to England and you're going to learn about the British invasion. So you're going to learn about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And I used to do this diagram. I should really figure out another way to do this. I know I could write it out and hold up a card. But, we talk about game changers in music, and we talk about Elvis. And Elvis is just such an important figure that he impacted all of rock and roll afterwards. We're still having the impact. And in fact, some of you saw the movie, and it was a little scary because some of you wrote your reply based on the movie, which wasn't all 100% accurate and didn't necessarily tell the full story or even what you get here. But Elvis is still an important figure today. And so without Elvis, you don't have all those figures that I mentioned, going through it. And you don't have the Beatles. Because if you didn't have Elvis and you didn't have Carl Perkins and Buddy Holly, and you had Little Richard and all that, but a lot of people didn't necessarily know it. You wouldn't have had that. Now, I can tell you right now that I'm sort of juggling 2 thoughts here. Let me go back to the thought on your assignments. When I talked about Elvis, I forewarned you just how important Elvis was. And that should give you a clue to the kind of depth that I'm looking for on an assignment. Because I'm getting people that are saying, how come I'm not getting all the points? Well, because you're not going into depth on it. And when I say you could have gone into more depth, that means you gotta do the work. The 250 words isn't depth. That's just sort of hitting the minimum. So when I talk about the importance of Elvis, that's what I expect. When I talk about the Beatles, if your goal is just to try to hit 250 words or to take things light and easy, don't expect to get a lot of points from the assignment, because I am telling you, there is no more important single figure in the history of popular music than Elvis. There is no more important band in the history of rock and pop in the world than the Beatles. Okay? So, and I'm going to ask you about that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why, and the book's going to explain why, and I'll tell you some. But when I'm giving you that forewarning, telling you the importance of them, you need to go into this assignment thinking, oh man, like, obviously this is serious. I need to get into the materials and make sure that I'm doing the work and understanding them. A lot of you aren't even referencing songs and albums and things like that. That's the point of this class. So it's setting it up for you right here. I'll tell you right now that there are colleges and universities that offer classes full semester just on the Beatles. You can go that deep easily on the Beatles. You could go that deep on the Rolling Stones. Not as deep on the Stones as on the Beatles, but you could go that deep. And so, we're just sort of getting the intro, which is really the focus of this class, right? This intro to all of these styles. This is a total big picture class. We're after the big picture of the history of rock and roll, and then you can dig and dive in. I still do. You see the books on my shelf, and I'm always, every time I go to a bookstore, I'm buying, a couple of books related to the history of rock and roll, whether it's on an artist, maybe it's on a period, maybe it's on a style, just because I like deeper stories. I want the depth. This is a bigger picture thing. Okay. So when I tell you that, it's understand, go into this week knowing that it is important. Go into this week knowing that you're going to need to spend some time. And I'm going to tell you something right now. It's one of my pet peeves. The Beatles were not a boy band. They were a band that was made up of young men, but they were not a boy band. So just to clarify what a boy band is or a girl band is in that context. And this goes back to, the 50s and the 60s, and it certainly comes up to today with BTS and folks like that. And of course the heyday of it with NSYNC and Backstreet Boys and all of that. But I know somebody mentioned like Blackpink, and that's a girl band, whatever. So boy bands are primarily just vocalists. They're not musicians. They may play a little bit. One Direction is an example, another example of a boy band they're not, you think about how an organic band comes together. They're friends, they answer ads, they do whatever. These things happen. And that's really what happened with both the Beatles and the Stones that we'll talk about. Boy bands are like fabricated bands that are put together by an impresario of some sort, whether it was Lou Pearlman with the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, whether it was Simon Cowell with One Direction. There is usually an important figure that, basically maybe they'll have big auditions, and that's what happened with One Direction and how they got together. I think they all individually were, was it X Factor, I think? Some of you will know. But, they didn't make it that, as all the way to the end, of course, but Simon Cowell said, wait, I see something here. I see money to be made. And the boy bands are really about money. And I know that we know them and we love them and all that sort of thing, but they're really satisfying a market that has been going on. I asked you about Teen Idol Pop and the role that it played socially, and a lot of you didn't get it. And it's in the book. It talks about how this idea of fabricated boyfriends and girlfriends and these fictitious loves and all that sort of thing. And so, that's what happens here. So the Beatles were not that. The Beatles were four young men, originally teenagers. I think George Harrison was 15 when they started all getting together. They were teenagers and became young men, but they were musicians that were playing in Liverpool. They started off, John Lennon had his group, the Quarrymen, and then he got introduced to Paul McCartney at this carnival, town carnival. What you'll see is that people will refer to it as a village fete, Fete, and a fete just means like a carnival, like a school carnival. And he was playing there, and they introduced, and then they formed the Quarrymen, and then eventually it went through all these name changes, Jerry and the Moondogs, and then the Silver Beatles, and then the Beatles. And that Silver Beatles was really inspired by Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So these impacts, right? Nothing exists in a vacuum. All these connections are there, okay? So Beatles were not a boy band, right? They were artists that got together and played. They played American rock and roll. That is what they loved. And over these next 2 weeks, you're going to learn about the British invasion in terms of popular music. And so the Beatles started in the late 50s, early 60s, different names. They eventually become the Beatles, and their first single comes out in 1962. And then the British invasion doesn't really start till 1964. And that's basically what happens is that the British popular music comes over here to the States and becomes very popular. And the Beatles were the first real band that broke through. And so sometimes I'll see students that will write, the Beatles were part of the British invasion. The Beatles started the British invasion. Okay. So it was they that broke through. Their appearances on Ed Sullivan, I Want to Hold Your Hand, the song, all of these things that come together that opened up this floodgate that then created the British invasion, by which later the Stones, the Kinks, the Who, and other bands made it through. Okay, so just like we might not know of Buddy Holly and Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis because of Elvis, and we might not have known to the level with Little Richard and Chuck Berry and all of that, we, in all possibility, might never have known who the Stones, the Kinks, and the Who were, and many others, if it weren't for the Beatles. Okay, that is just one way of how they're important. They spent years and hours honing their craft. If you haven't read the, books by Malcolm Gladwell, put that on your list and start reading them. And I'm blanking on the name of the book that he talks about the concept of 10,000 hours in. But he talks about this idea that it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert. And he uses the Beatles as an example because when they were in Hamburg, Germany, and they were playing, 6-7 nights a week for 4 or 5 hours a night, they were honing their craft, and they were playing American songs. They were a cover band, really. And all of these bands that we're going to talk about were cover bands. Now, keep in mind, we're in the 60s. Early 60s, remember, is still just AM radio. But records are out, so singles is still the main part of the market. The Beatles actually have a role in changing that. And so the Beatles then, they start writing their own songs, and then they start to become popular in England, and then eventually they become popular here. And then it breaks the gates wide open. So I'm not going to go into giving you like every example of what made the Beatles so important, because it's in the book, and that's in the class. In materials, right? So I want you to go there and find it. I'm going to tell you, there's this book on the shelf behind me, right? It's backwards. There, called How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, and it's an incredible book. It's not an anti-Beatles book. When it first came to my attention, I was like, uh-oh. But what it talks about is how the Beatles, through the course of just 7 years, they were only a band for 7 years, 1962 to 1969. Even though the last album was released, Let It Be was released in 70, they were already broken up. And if you haven't had a chance to watch the Beatles documentary on Disney Plus, watch it. Spend the hours, all the hours watching it. It is amazing. It is a masterclass of how to be a band and how to write songs. It's really quite phenomenal. But this idea that the Beatles took what was pop music, and they certainly were more of a pop band early on. And then by the time you get into 65 and 66, they start to change. Some of that change comes because of influence of what Brian Wilson was doing with the Beach Boys. So that's why I got Brian right next to them there. Because Brian Wilson was pushing the art form. And when he comes out with Pet Sounds in 1966, and the song, I was blanking, it was Wouldn't It Be Nice? And God Only Knows. They're just two of the greatest songs ever written by anybody ever. But anyways, so, Brian Wilson was pushing the art form, and the Beatles, there was this healthy rivalry. They ended up becoming friends. And Paul McCartney, has said that his favorite album of all time is Pet Sounds. And so the Beach Boys would push the art form, and then the Beatles would take it and push it farther, and then the Beach Boys would push it farther. And so that went, and that's eventually how you get to Sgt. Pepper's in 1967. And what happens with the Beatles is that basically you go from this band that's playing 2.5 and 3 minute long songs, pop songs and rock songs, to these more sophisticated listening experiences. Some of this is because of the movement from mono to stereo, which I talked about. Although they mixed everything in mono so that it would work, because the technology really hadn't taken off quite yet. It was also the idea, influenced by Pet Sounds, that an album could be treated as a whole. Now, obviously in classical music, this was a thing. In sort of older popular music, i.e. Frank Sinatra, we have this thing, what's called a concept album. And so a concept album is an album where all the songs are unified. They tell a story. It's unified by a theme. There's some connecting thing in it. So a famous example is Frank Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours of the Night. And that album, all those songs are like songs that you would hear in the wee small hours of the night. So the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds is a there's kind of a concept behind it about the progress of a relationship, a young relationship. Frank Zappa was also doing concept albums. The Beatles, Sgt. Pepper was a concept album, not in that it told a story, but that it was unified around this fictitious band, this Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it has this circus theme, and there's all this intercut sound effects and all of that, which is important to the work that they did. And they really changed popular music from something you would dance to or make out to or whatever, to something you would actually sit down and listen to, more like you would listen to classical music. Some of this comes as a result of having the producer they were assigned to back in 61, 62, George Martin, whose experience was as a classical and comedy producer, not stand-up comedy, but like sketch comedy on albums. And so he was able to bring something new to the level and to the game for the Beatles as well. And they really transformed popular music. From by the time you get to Rubber Soul and then you get to Sgt. Pepper's in 67, everybody now has to respond to that and has to deal with the idea that popular music is now a different thing. That doesn't mean we still don't have, light pop and kind of the throwaway bubblegum pop, we would call it, or teen idol pop, but it's also taken on a level of depth that was just unimaginable. And all of that came by way of the Beatles. Now, on the other side, you have the Rolling Stones. And the Rolling Stones are a very different band. I often refer to the Rolling Stones as the greatest American band that happened to come from England. And the reason that I say that is so the roots of the Beatles' music was in a British style called skiffle that was influenced by American kind of folk music, and also rock and roll. The Rolling Stones had different influences. They were very much influenced in American blues, and they were blues aficionados. And there was a whole kind of cult of American blues, not in a bad way, but you know what I mean, over in England. There were people that were just, they loved it. Now, all these blues artists, Willie Dixon and John Lee Hooker and, Muddy Waters and all these folks, they had all kind of fallen out of popularity as rhythm and blues rose, but there was a really loyal audience. And so some of these blues artists, as they got older, they were touring in England, and some of these British musicians would back them up. And so there were a whole group of English artists, British artists that loved the blues. And we'll learn more about that next week. But understand that was an important foundation for the Rolling Stones, as was rhythm and blues. They loved Motown. They loved really American black music, and they loved country music. And so from this point going forward, when you listen to the Rolling Stones, you will hear those influences coming in. You'll hear the blues, you'll hear rhythm and blues, and you'll hear country music. It's sometimes very, very obviously. The number of songs that the Stones came out with that truly have a, quote, British kind of sound are minimal. Even like one of my favorite Stones songs, maybe I'll tell this story real quick, but is You Can't Always Get What You Want. And the song has this, opens with this boys choir, and it's very British and proper sounding. And then it kind of turns into almost like a country song in feel. Now, I'm gonna sort of put myself out there. I know we're getting near 20 minutes, but it's okay. To talk about the Beatles and the Stones, it could be hours. But I try to make a point in my semesters to sort of connect on this way. And so I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable with you, but I think it's worth it. So first of all, these last 2.5 years have been really hard. And I think we can all agree that the pandemic put a lot of pressure on us, threw us into something that we couldn't have imagined. Really nothing that we've seen in our lifetime, really in the last 100 years. The Spanish flu was in 1918 and 1718. And so we really had no context for this. So it was really hard. But life sometimes is just really hard anyways. And especially if you're a teenager and you're going through all these just sort of raging emotions and hormones, and life is chaotic. It really is. There's a lot of it in there. There's beauty. There's, there's great things in life. There really are, I assure you. But there was a time in my teen years when I was going through a dark little patch. And I was, like most of us, I think, do at some point, I was questioning, like, is this even worth it? Like really, is this how life's going to be for the next 50, 60, 70 years? Because if it is, I don't necessarily think that I want to stick around for that. That doesn't seem like a lot of fun. And so I was in not a good way. And one day, and this speaks to a lot of things, but it speaks a lot to the power of music. I was probably listening to the radio. I don't remember the day. I don't even remember the place. But what I remember was hearing the Rolling Stones song, "You Can't Always Get What You Want." Now, the Rolling Stones, I love. I grew up, I was born in 65. So, I was aware of them my whole life growing up. But I really didn't become, I became, of course, with Satisfaction and songs like that I was hearing, when I was a littler kid. And then I was 13 when, oh man, how did I just blank on the album? The album that has "Miss You" on it. It's in here, and I'm going to find it because it matters. And it's, I keep wanting to say "Tattoo You," but it's not. Some Girls. I didn't even have to see it. It came. Some Girls. I was 13 when Some Girls came out. It's still one of my favorite albums by anybody. It's so good. If you want to hear a great country song, listen to that album. If you want to hear great blues songs, you want to hear great, all sorts of great mix, listen to that album. I'll just leave it there. Anyways, so some point, somehow, the song "You Can't Always Get What You Want" came on. And first of all, it's a gorgeous song. It opens up with this choir and singing "You Can't Always Get What You Want." And then this French horn solo comes in, and then this acoustic guitar comes in out of it, and then Mick Jagger sings a song and tells this story. But what spoke to me in my core, like just reached into the depth, was the idea that you can't always get what you want, but you might get what you need, and that sometimes getting what you need is enough. And as a teenage kid, that was like this incredible truth to me. And so I bring that up, one, to share the power of music and to share the power of songs, and why I never, I may not like a song you like, but I would never argue the power of it to you personally. But I do that also, I share this also because you may be in a dark place, or you may know somebody in a dark place, or it may be yet to come. And it's worth it. And if you're ever sitting there and you're really struggling and you're not sure, you can reach out to me. You have my email address. It's as long as I'm teaching, you'll have my email address. And you can always find me. You can always find me on, through Google and crap too. But I'm here for you. And so I know that sometimes life sucks, and sometimes it's really hard. And sometimes you have to wonder, is it really worth it? And it is worth it. It's worth it for the people, and it's worth it for the beauty that's around us. And I've lost people to suicide, people that were very dear to me. And the wreckage and the pain that leaves, I believe in my heart of hearts that if that person, those people could have comprehended what would happen afterwards, they wouldn't have done it. That said, sometimes things are going on physiologically and emotionally and all of that and psychologically that we can't even think clearly. So if you're finding that darkness is around you and it's closing in, reach out to someone that's around you that loves you. Be honest, be open, tell them, tell your parents, tell your friends, share in that. And again, you can always reach out to me. And if you see that in somebody else, don't stand by, but reach out. Okay. So sorry to take that little detour, but I feel that it's important, to sort of get honest about that. So yeah, you're going to learn about the Beatles. You're going to learn about the Stones. You're going to listen to some incredible music. Please listen to the music, listen to the songs, listen to the words, because great care and lots of time was put into making them for us. And at least they can make our day better, and sometimes they can change our lives. So do good work, do the work, have a great week. Talk to you soon.